On July 13, 1863, the discontent of the working-class population over a new law passed by the U.S. Congress to draft men to fight in the ongoing American Civil War resulted in violent civil unrests known as the New York City Draft Riots. Although the rioters, overwhelmingly white working-class men, initially intended to express their anger at the draft, the protest quickly turned into a racially charged riot targeting the city's black population and resulting in over 2,000 deaths and 8,000 injured. Also, over 50 buildings, primarily black homes, 2 Protestant churches, and the Colored Orphan Asylum, which housed black orphans, were burned to the ground. Many black residents left Manhattan permanently and moved to Brooklyn. By the end of the year, the city's black population had fallen tremendously. In today's episode, we narrate the causes, the course, and the consequences of the most significant and most racially charged civil unrest in American history. Early in 1863, the United States Congress passed a law to draft men to fight in the ongoing American Civil War. The law made all male citizens between 20 and 35 and unmarried men between 35 and 45 subject to military service. However, a provision in the law allowed a man to buy his way out by paying an amount of $300. Little as it may sound, the amount represented the annual income of the average American worker at the time, making the avoidance of military service only possible for the super rich. To make matters worse, blacks were exempted from the draft, as they were not considered American citizens at the time, thereby making the working white population of New York the principal target for military service. Note that New York City had not welcomed the Civil War from the onset. Before the outbreak of the war, cotton represented 40% of the city's export. As the nation's business capital, losing the South as a trading partner had devastating effects on the city's economy. In fact, when the war broke out back in April 1861, Fernando Wood, the New York City mayor, had called on the city's Board of Councilors to declare the city's independence from Washington. Early in 1863, newspapers published derogatory articles of black people, ridiculed black aspirations of equal rights and privileges, and emphasized the evils of interracial socializing and relationships. A few months prior, in September 1862, President Abraham Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which decreed the freedom of over 4 million enslaved black people. This alarmed much of the white working class in New York, who feared competing with the freed black slaves for low-wage jobs. Minor protests started in March 1863, when white longshoremen refused to work with the 200 newly recruited black laborers and physically assaulted some black recruits. Now, with the new law exempting blacks from the drafts, their greatest fear had befallen them. The first draft numbers were drawn on July 11, 1863. Surprisingly, the city remained suspiciously quiet. However, after the second drawing on July 13th, a furious crowd of about 500 white working men attacked the Assistant 9th District Provost Marshal's office at the 3rd Avenue and 47th Street, where the draft was taking place, and halted the draft selection. They smashed the doors and windows of the office with large paving stones and shattered the rotating lottery bin before setting the whole building on fire. However, a brave fireman, John Decker, and a small team of firefighters broke through the angry mob and tried to put out the fire to prevent it from burning down the neighboring buildings. The rioters broke up the fire trucks, killed horses pulling streetcars, and smashed the cars. To prevent city officials from being notified of the riots, rioters cut off all telegraph lines they could find. The New York Metropolitan Police was sent to suppress the riot. Police Superintendent John Kennedy arrived at the scene and examined the situation. Though not in uniform, some of the rioters recognized and attacked him. He was severely beaten and left unconscious. The other officers drew their clubs and revolvers and charged the crowd, but were overwhelmingly outnumbered. The Provost Guard was dispatched to suppress the riots. They tried to disperse the mob with a volley of gunfire, but were overpowered and suffered 1 death and 14 injured. As the rioters marched through 44th Street, they made a stop at the Bull's Head Hotel and burned it down after the hotel owner refused to provide free alcohol to the mob. From there, they marched to the mayor's residence on 5th Avenue, but spared it after a local judge appealed to the crowd. They then marched on the 8th and 5th District police stations and set the buildings on fire. Though fire engine companies responded to extinguish the flames, some of the firefighters were sympathetic to the rioters because their names had also featured in the draft. From there, the protesters descended on the Lower Manhattan Media District to attack the offices of the New York Times and the New York Tribune, but came under heavy gunfire by the newspaper's staffers, including Henry Jarvis Raymond, founder of the New York Times. These news houses were alleged to be pro-war and to have openly supported the drafts. The mob beat, tortured, and killed any black people they met on the streets, hanging the bodies on trees and setting them ablaze. The murdered victims that Tuesday morning include a 7-year-old nephew of Robert John Simmons, a black sergeant in the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, and a black man who was dragged out of his home in West 27th Street, beaten down on the sidewalk, horribly pounded to death, and his body hanged to a tree. Later that afternoon, the rioters marched to the Colored Orphan Asylum, a 4-story building at 44th Street and 5th Avenue, which provided shelter to 233 black orphans. By that time, their number had grown to over 2,000 protesters, predominantly Irish immigrants and Irish Americans. They looted the orphanage, taking bedding, food, clothing, and other goods before setting the building on fire. But John Decker, the brave fireman, responded immediately and confronted the crowd despite having no police protection. Decker and his men made several unsuccessful attempts to break through the crowd, but were far outnumbered. The mob became angered at his repeated interference and threatened to take his life if he tried to put out the fire. Decker went up to the steps of the building and attempted to address the crowd of over 2,000 rioters, saying it would be a disgrace to humanity and to the state of New York to burn down a building whose purpose has only been to serve the motherless and less privileged. He thought his words would appeal to the conscience of the rioters, but he was wrong. The men grabbed him and tried to hang him, but his men quickly surrounded him and snuck him through the crowd. When the firefighters realized they could not put out the fire, Decker and a policeman led the children out the back door to safety, while the other firemen distracted the crowd in front of the building. The mob also attacked and destroyed black homes and businesses, such as James McCune Smith's pharmacy at 93rd West Broadway, the first black-owned pharmacy in the country. Heavy rain fell that Monday night, helping to put out the fires and sending rioters home, but the crowd returned the next day to continue their carnage. On the second day, the rioters turned their rage toward white people who sympathized with or had any affiliations with blacks. Amongst the victims were Abby Gibbons, a renowned social welfare activist who fought for the abolition of black slavery, whose house was burned to the ground; Ann Derrickson and Ann Martin, 2 white women married to black men who were attacked by armed protesters; and Mary Burke, a white prostitute who catered to black men, was gravely assaulted. Hoping to appeal to the predominantly Irish Catholic mob, the city's leaders implored the Irish-born Archbishop John Hughes of the Archdiocese of New York to get involved. Hughes addressed the rioters from his residence at St. Patrick's Cathedral with a message of peace and love. His appeal fell on deaf ears. The rioters torched white-owned businesses near the docks that employed black people and destroyed white-owned properties with black tenants. As a result, landlords, fearing that the mob would destroy their buildings, drove black residents from their homes, thereby putting them on the streets at the mercy of the rioters. The Democratic governor Horatio Seymour, who had opposed the draft law, calling it unconstitutional, was reluctant to take severe measures against the rioters. When Seymour arrived at the city hall, he addressed the crowd in a rather cajoling manner. Contrarily, the city's Republican mayor, George Opdyke, wired the War Department to send federal troops to end the riot. In response, General John Ellis Wool, commander of the Eastern District, brought approximately 800 soldiers and Marines from the West Point Military Academy and the Brooklyn Navy Yard. He also ordered the return of 4,000 New York State militia, which had been sent to assist the Union troops in the Battle of Gettysburg. By evening, all the soldiers were in place, ready to suppress the revolt come Wednesday morning. Late on Tuesday, the Assistant Provost Marshal General received an order from above to postpone the draft. The information was published in the papers on Wednesday morning. News of the postponement spread across the city, causing some of the rioters to stay home. However, other recalcitrant protesters still took to the street to continue their atrocities. They were confronted by the New York State militia, who beat them mercilessly, killing about 12 rioters and severely injuring many others in the Murray Hill neighborhood. The remaining mob fled to their homes, and by 9:00 p.m., the whole city was quiet. The manifestation left almost a quarter of the city's black population homeless, either because their properties were destroyed or because they were kicked out by landlords, fearing that the mob would destroy their buildings. Hundreds of buildings were wrecked, with at least 50 burned to the ground. Although official reports estimate at least 115 deaths and over 2,000 injured, some independent researchers and historians reported much higher figures of over 2,000 deaths and 8,000 wounded. The total property damage was estimated at $5 million, which is over $100 million in present-day value. Many black families fled the city, with some settling in New Jersey permanently. By the end of the following year, the city's black population had dropped to below 10,000, the lowest since the 1920s. Surprisingly, only 67 people were convicted for their role in the riots, and none received a significant prison sentence. The New York Draft Riots are the most violent insurrection in American history. Draft riots also occurred in other cities like Detroit and Boston, but were nowhere near as severe as New York. The insurrection completely changed the demographics of New York City, with white residents exerting their control and becoming clearly separated from the black population in the workplace. The riots resulted in an emergency bill to provide low-interest loans to people looking to buy draft exemption and a temporary suspension of the draft itself. A month later, the government resumed the draft in New York and was completed within 10 days without public interference. However, much fewer men were drafted than anticipated. Of the 750,000 people selected nationwide for conscription, only about 45,000 went into active military service. In December, the Union League Club recruited more than 2,000 black soldiers and paraded them through the city to the Hudson River docks. A crowd of over 100,000 people watched the procession and applauded the men in uniforms. Sometime later, the Colored Orphan Asylum attempted to rebuild on the same site. Still, the other property owners in the neighborhood protested. Consequently, the orphanage was rebuilt in a sparsely settled area north of the city that would later be known as Harlem. Thank you for watching. If you have a video idea, why not leave a comment below? And if we make it, we'll give you a big shout out. And please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell for more videos on crime stories, notorious outlaws, and historical scandals.